Hey YouTube, it's Jay, and today we're going to do 9-ball break number 4. So 9-ball break number 4, this is a form of a slam break. And so a slam break is when you hit the balls really hard and you kind of hope something falls in. They tend to be last resort breaks, but this one was really a staple break back in the late 70s, early 80s. It's one that was used by Rempe and Jim Rempe. Mike Siegel used it a lot back then. Earl Strickland used it. Pretty much everybody used it. The purpose of this break is to exploit small gaps in the rack when you are hand racking. So the idea is that you look for gaps, and let's take a look at what those look like. We're talking about really tiny gaps. So let's look at what those look like. Okay, so you can see that with the hand rack, the 2 and the 4 have sprung loose, and that happens on this table all the time, creating gaps. Here's a closer look at those gaps. Now, the important thing about this is these gaps are in the center of the rack. So let's look at the momentum and the direction of travel of all the balls. So because of the gaps, all of the green arrows you see here, those are the directions the balls are going to take, and those balls that have the green arrows are going to move at normal speed. Now, normally in a magic rack or a template, the 9-ball doesn't move, but you can see here it's going to move down and to the left. This is assuming that we're breaking from the left side, the opposite side from the gaps. So the 1 ball picks up a lot of speed. The 3, the 5, the 7, the 8, and the 6, because they're all frozen, are all going to move at decent speeds, but the 2 and the 4 are going to very slowly move out of the way. And because of the gaps in the rack, it allows the 9-ball to move, because normally what happens is the energy transferring through the 9-ball in a completely frozen rack means that the 9-ball can't move. So the important thing to know here is that what we're doing is we're taking advantage of the gaps to try, or we're using the angle that we are attacking the rack to try to give more power to the 2 balls that aren't going to move very much, the 2 and the 4 in this case. So we're deliberately hitting into those gaps. We're trying to make the balls with the gaps move faster. That's what we're trying to exploit. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the rack and we're going to see, take the left side, add all the gaps up, and take the right side and add all the gaps up. The one with the most gap space is going to be the opposite side that you're breaking on. So if we see a lot of gaps over here on the right, we're going to break. If we see them on the camera right, we're going to break on the camera left. If we see them on the camera left, we're going to break from the camera right. Now, because of the way my rack is setting up, I am going to be breaking primarily from this left side. Now, so here's the deal. When you rack by hand, it is virtually impossible to get a perfectly frozen rack. Can it be done under ideal circumstances? Yes, or if somebody banged the balls in, or if, like on my table, they've used a magic rack almost exclusively and it's basically drilled those spots in the rack onto the table. But when I remove the rack, even on my table, you probably couldn't see it, but the 2 and the 4 rolled off a little. And so you have to re-rack and retighten until you get a good rack. And even when you have one that looks perfectly frozen, it's not. There will be gaps in the rack when you hand rack. Now, the important thing about a rack when you're using a triangle rack is that the 1, the 2, and the 3 are frozen. As long as they're frozen, you'll get good action throughout the rack. So that's why when you see the pros and they're checking out the rack, they're always doing this and shielding the light and looking between these first 3 balls. That's because those 3 balls are the most important to a good rack when you're racking with something other than a template rack. So we're going to try to exploit that, okay? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to set the cue ball. We're going to set so that the edge of the cue ball lines up with the spot. So we're actually half a ball to the left or to the right of the center. We're going to hit this, as with every brake, we're going to try to hit down into it. Now I'm not going to get as much power as I used to get because of the problem with my hand not opening, so I can't elevate my bridge high enough. It hurts to do it. But we're going to try to hit down into the cue ball, not at that angle, but like maybe about that angle, and we're going to hit one tip above center. What we're trying to accomplish is we want the cue ball to leave the table a little bit so that the cloth doesn't take away the friction. You're not going to get the power on this brake that you will from next to the rail. You'll get maybe 70–80% of the same power you get from the side brake. So we need to do everything we can to reduce factors that are going to slow the cue ball down on the way. So we want it to come up off very, very slightly off. And you can see from braking, well, you may or may not be able to see, but there are spots along the way where the cue ball lands. What we want to do is have the cue ball land just as it makes contact with the one. What's going to happen is the cue ball is going to, if the cue ball lands right when it hits the one, it's going to hop up in the air and park in the center of the table. Now, as I said, I do not have the same power that I used to have on the center brake, on the open table brake, and I do not have the, I don't practice this brake any longer. I used to practice it all the time. This was my primary brake for at least 10 years. I mean, pre-tour 10 years. And this is the brake I used in the 2001 US Open that was so successful that I had other players asking me about how I was doing it. So what mine will most likely look like is the cue ball is going to come, it's going to hit the one, it's going to come back while spinning forward, and then hopefully it parks. Sometimes the ball hits it and moves it, but our objective is to park it out here. We want to park it in this area. Now this is a top English brake. If you draw this brake, well, so first of all, if you hit with no English, you're going to scratch in one of the top two corners. If you hit it with draw, you're going to end up with the cue ball down here and the one ball up there. So we don't want to do that. You want to hit it with top English, you want it to come off, and you want it to park in the center of the table. Let me show you what that looks like. All right, so what are the conditions for this? Well, the conditions for using this are, number one, your side brakes aren't working because we would rather brake from the side. You have a higher incidence of making balls. We do not want to be using a magic rack or a template rack as a general rule. This is, at this point, this is kind of a brake of last resort in a tournament setting, but it's really good if you're playing out at a pool hall or something where, you know, people bang the balls in so the one doesn't freeze all the way, or when you do freeze to the one, then stuff in the back is loose. That's really where this brake shines, is in random circumstances where you're not getting a consistent rack, you're getting a different rack every time. This brake is really good for that. One thing I do like about this brake, so when you brake from the side, the 8-ball normally comes down and comes out like this, okay? Or it goes the other way and does like that, depending on which side you brake from. With this brake, the 8-ball goes straight down because you're hitting straight into it, so it's got directly straight momentum, comes straight down and comes straight back up and moves the 9 quite often. Now that's not our goal with this brake. Our goal with this brake is to exploit the gaps and make balls because of the gaps. So our goals with this are just like any other offensive brake. We want to pocket a ball, we want to have a shot on the one or on the next ball afterwards. That's our entire goal here. As I said, this brake, use it when the side brakes aren't working. Many times the reason the side brake doesn't work is because there are small micro gaps in the rack. So if there are, then this will try to take advantage of this by putting as much power into the brake as possible. Now, the downside to this brake is that the balls do tend to hang together because you're getting equal momentum on the balls pretty much throughout the rack. So you will see packs and clusters and groups of balls near each other that you have to maneuver around. That's the downside to this brake. It's not a wide open brake like you would expect with a side brake. But even so, I mean, you're going to see the balls just basically spread out and they go to the rails. Now my rails down here are a little bit deader than they should be, simply because my cloth is pulling out. I do have the guy who did the table coming back to do what they call a repull, which is where they take the rails off and they basically pull the staples out and pull the cloth back over tight again. Not unusual for a Brunswick to have to do that after a break-in period because the cloth does loosen up. Simona's loosens up a little bit, and once it loosens up, you get these situations. So, and you can see it under here too where it looks wavy. That happens because the cloth is loosening up. So anyhow, all right, so this is your aiming point for this brake. You're going to be aiming where the 8 and the 6 come together. I know the 8's kind of hard to see there because of the shadowing, but you're aiming for the gap. You're aiming for the point where the 8 and the 6 come together. That's your starting point on this one. As with any brake, you'll be adjusting once you know how the brake is working out for you. So these are the different adjustment points. So you can see I've got the gap between the 8 and the 6 marked with the big star. You can also aim directly at the top of the 8 if you find out that your cue ball is drifting to the right. You can aim for the gap between the 2 and the 9 if it's drifting to the left. Your outside edge of this is the 1. All right, so that's the brake. Now, let's go ahead and do our 10 brakes and see how successful we are. I will tell you my expectation is that this is not going to be as consistent as those side brakes for a couple of reasons. One, because it's not a magic rack, so you don't have that wing ball going every time. 2, because with the problem with my hand, I can't get the full elevation and power that I should be getting on this. And 3, oh, by the way, I don't know if you noticed it, but I drove the cue into the table and you could see it bending. That is how this brake is supposed to look. If it doesn't do that, you're not hitting at an angle down far enough. You need that for that to happen. That's part of the power. And you can see that on some players, it's extreme. So back in the 80s, Mike Siegel, when he would brake, his cue, even when he was on the side brake, whether it was center brake or side brake, his cue would bend almost to the point of braking. I mean, it was right there at the point where you were sure it was about to snap. But you want that, you want that punch of the cue ball bouncing off the table. And to do that, you have to drive down into the cloth. You're not going to rip the cloth. If you did, the cloth was badly installed or just bad. Anyhow, okay, so let's do our 10 brakes and let's see where we are. All right, so thank you for joining me. That's 9-ball break number 4. And if you like what you see, of course, hit like, hit subscribe, ding the notification bell. If I don't beg, nobody does it, sorry. And we will see you next time.